Welcome everybody, Brother Dan Goodwin here, your host, the God's Final Jubilee program, God's Final Jubilee Ministries. Got an exciting program for you tonight, a needed program because there's a lot of confusion out there in prophecy land about the Jubilee. And we're going to discuss the Jubilee tonight. We're going to discuss the seven feast a little bit, but mostly the Jubilee and the sabbatical cycles. And let me go ahead and get our music on here. Here we go. All right, so we are going to discuss something pretty important here tonight. Let me read you something here if I can find my paper. Here we go. Tonight, here's what we're gonna look at. We're gonna look at when does a Jubilee begin. Some are saying it begins in the month of Nisan. Now that's Passover month. There's all of a sudden in recent days, I'm seeing this everywhere, and people are sending me notes asking me about it, and so I wanted to address that tonight. I'm not gonna mention any names. There's some good folks who are talking about this. There are some folks that I know who are actually involved in this and that are promoting the Nisan Jubilee. In other words, the Jubilee year beginning in the month of Nisan instead of the fall month of Tishri. Some good men. I'm not going to mention any names because I don't want to hurt anybody. That's not my intention tonight. I want to try to bring some correction and some help. And I'm going to give you my viewpoint. I've studied this a long time, and I've restudied it again in the last couple of days. I've read several articles by some folks who are pushing the Nisan Passover time Jubilee. I've read several articles and made some notes on them. And so in other words, I said, okay, what if I'm wrong? Let me look at what they're saying. And I did so. And I am more strongly a proponent of a Tishri Jubilee than I ever was. I've got some things clarified in my mind even better than before I looked into this. All right, and I've been teaching on the Jubilee for a long time. You see my book there. That came out in 2014. I have studied the Jubilee for a long time, and I think I cracked the door open a little further in 2014 through 2016 and helped a lot of people. I think we did with the Jubilee. So we want to go a little further here and try to explain and clarify some things tonight. So a couple other things that are on the docket here. Which is the New Year for Israel? It appears there's some confusion on when New Year's is in Israel. Is it Tishri 1 in the fall? On the Feast of Trumpets called Rosh Hashanah, which means head of the year, which is the day that Israel celebrates New Year. The changing of the calendar in Israel is on Tishri 1. Just a few months ago, we crossed from the year 5777 in Israel to the year 5778. When did that happen? On Nisan? No, Tishri 1, a fall month, usually September or October on our calendar. And I'll show you the calendar in a few minutes here. We are going to look at the Jewish calendar in a little bit here. We're going to explain some very simple and very needed things that you need to understand. All right. So when is New Year? I'm going to show you when I believe New Year's is in Israel. We're going to look at the sabbatical cycles. By that we mean the 6 years they planted their gardens. On the 7th year, it's a Sabbath. Remember, there are 3 major Sabbaths in Israel. Number 1 is the 7-day Sabbath, which is Saturday. And they were to rest on that day. And God set that precedent in Genesis 1. 6 days God created. On the 7th day, God rested, right? You're with me there. The second major Sabbath in the Bible is the 7-year Sabbath. So the 7-day Sabbath, the 7-year Sabbath, which is the 6 years they planted their gardens. On the 7th year, they did not plant their garden. They let their land rest, or they were supposed to. Now, they very seldom kept that, and resulted in the 7-year captivity as well. So the 7-year Sabbath. That's Sabbath number 2. The third major Sabbath is the Jubilee. The Jubilee is the super Sabbath, I call it. And that's every 7 cycles of those 7 years, or 49 years. This is all in Leviticus 25. 7 of those cycles of 7 years each is 49 years on that. At the end of that 49th year, note what I just said there, at the end of that 49th year, the trumpet of the Jubilee is sounded, and the Jubilee begins another huge Sabbath where for an entire year they again do not plant their gardens, and has to do with property. All property goes back to the original owner. For the entire 50th year is a Jubilee. What we're going to learn tonight and discuss is, when did the Jubilee actually begin on the calendar, and when does it end? All right, we're going to look at that. There's a movement out there and a group of folks who are talking about a Nisan, the month of Nisan, Passover month. And they're saying that Passover month is the new year. They're saying it is actually the beginning of the Jubilee. And I am not a proponent of that. I am on the other side of this. So we're also going to discuss the controversy of the 6-year let the land rest. The 7th day you rest, or 6 days you sow your garden. On the 7th day you let the land rest. There's a lot of confusion about this. There's two camps on this. And camp number 1 says that on the Jubilee year, on the 50th year, so you got your 49 years, and then year 50 is the Jubilee. One camp says that Jubilee year, 50th year, which is the Jubilee, also is year number 1 of the next sabbatical cycle. In other words, during Jubilee on the 50th year, they're saying that you got to count that Jubilee as year number 1 on the next series of 7 years. I do not agree with that, and I'm going to prove that to you. The other side is the side that I believe is that the Jubilee year stands alone. After the 49 years, the Jubilee is the 50th year. It takes place. There are no sabbatical cycle years counted on the 50th year. There cannot be. Because if there is, it throws the whole 50-year cycle off. For instance, 6,000 years of history is going to be, I believe, 120 Jubilees. That will not work if you count Jubilees differently. If you count the Jubilees in a 49, or if you count the sabbatical cycle, 49 years, and then you count year number 1 of the next sabbatical cycle during the Jubilee, then you're going to have 49 years. You're going to lose a year every 50 years. All right, so I could show you that easier on paper, but we won't take the time. 70 Jubilees from Moses to the end, and 40 years from Christ to the end of the New Testament church age. These are all Jubilees, and they will not fit in a 49-year cycle. You have to count 50-year cycles, or you'll be lost. You'll never figure this out. And that's obvious on the internet. A lot of folks are not figuring this out. All right, so that's what we're going to discuss in this broadcast here. I'm going to try to keep this brief, but hang with me here. Let me read you some statements. I wrote these down last night about 1 o'clock this morning. I wrote these down, and because I discovered something, and some lights came on to where I haven't changed my mind, but I understand it a little better, and I think I'm going to be able to explain it to you. Let me say, number 1, God is not the author of confusion. 1 Corinthians 14. God is not the author of confusion, but there's no reason to be confused on this. Now, there's some things in the Bible God hasn't made plain. That's fine. But there are other things that God has made plain. There's nothing to be confused about here. Number 2, God is a God of order. I mean, 7 feasts, 7 churches, 7 candlesticks, the 7 angels, the seven trumpets, the 7 vials, and over again we could go. God is a God of order. The Jubilee is going to fall in order. The 7 sabbatical years, they all are in order. The 7 feasts, very orderly. God is a God of order. Would you agree with me there? Number 3, God is a God of perfection. And of course, the number 7 is God's number of perfection. I am convinced, as sure as I'm sitting here, that the world will stand for 7,000 years, and that's it. And then the great white throne takes place, and then a new heaven and a new earth. I believe God created this universe inside of time and space, and I believe it's a 7,000-year period of history. And God's a God of order. God's a God of perfection. He's not the God of confusion, not the author of confusion. I believe in the 7,000-year earth, and which means we're very close to the end of this thing. This is not 2018 like it says on our calendar, because we started our calendar at the wrong place. All right, number 5. Let me say this. It has to end where it began. To be a perfect 6,000-year time and then a perfect millennium, perfect 1,000-year millennium, time has to end where it began. Are you with me there? For a complete day, it has to end where it began, right? If a day starts at midnight, and it does on our clock, now on the Jewish clock it doesn't, but on our clock a day starts at midnight, right? You see the clock on the right there. For a complete day to happen, where do you got to end up? You got to end up back at midnight for a complete day. That's simple, right? The Jewish clock starts at 6 p.m., sundown. 6 p.m. basically. For a complete day to take place, what's got to happen? The clock has got to cycle all the way back to 6 p.m. again for a complete day. That is no different with the 6,000-year earth. 6,000-year earth has to go back where it began, or it's not a 6,000-year period. To have a perfect 7,000 years in history, this thing has got to end where it began. Are you with me there? Now this is kind of important. This is going to turn some lights on for you. It's going to help you understand some things. It has to end where it started. Isaiah, let me read Isaiah 46 for you. I think I have it right here. Isaiah 46, look what it says. The book of Isaiah, chapter 46, beginning in verse 8. Remember this and show yourselves men. Bring it again to mind, O ye transgressors. Remember the former things of old. For I am God and there is none else. I am God and there is none like me. Now listen to what he says in verse 10. Declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times the things that are not yet done. Very simply, what that verse is saying is, you want to know about the end? Go back to the beginning and you'll understand. So, you want to know, he telleth the end from the beginning. Where's the beginning? Genesis chapter 1, and of course the whole book of Genesis. Genesis means beginning. And so, you want to know about the end? Go back to the beginning. All right, so when does a day begin in Israel? We learn that where? At the beginning, Genesis 1. The evening and the morning were the first day. The evening and the morning were the second day, and the third day, and the fourth day. 6 times God says the evening and the morning were the first day, second day, third day, all the way to the 6th day. All right, pretty. So God tells us a day on God's calendar begins at 6 p.m., evening and the morning. I believe creation happened exactly, day 1 took place, I believe, from 6 p.m. to 6 p.m. on the first day. And I believe that it was Tishri 1, that fall month. The Jews believe that. Josephus believed that. The Bishop Usher believed that. Many people believe that. In fact, you'll find in the Bible, before Exodus chapter 12, you'll find that the first month was the month of Tishri. Well, let me go a little further here, and we'll get to that calendar in a minute. It has to end where it started. In other words, if the calendar started in Genesis at 6 p.m. on Tishri 1, where does this got to end up later on? That's right. It's got to end up right there, or it's not a perfect 6,000-year time on the earth and then a perfect 1,000-year millennium. Are you with me there? If it's going to be a perfect 6,000 years or 7,000 years, it has to end where it started. Now, either it started in Nisan or it started in Tishri. The Bible doesn't tell us. However, the Bible does tell us that the first, month number 1 in Old Testament days before the book of Exodus was the month of Tishri. And God changed everything in Exodus chapter 12. That's where I want to take you next. In Exodus chapter 12, in verse 1, let me see if I can get back here and find that for you real quick. Instead of just quoting it, I'll look it up here. Here we go. Exodus chapter 12 and verse 1, here's what the Lord said to Moses. This is when they're in bondage in Egypt, remember? And God is going to deliver them with the Passover lambs and the blood on the doorpost. God is going to deliver them out of there. You can see that right here. We can see Passover, the blood on the doorpost there. And here's what God told Moses was going to change. Something was going to change here. God said, the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron, this is Exodus 12, verse 1 and 2. The Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, this month, what month? The month that they leave Egypt, the Passover month. This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. He didn't say it was New Year. He said, to you it will be the first month of the year. So from Exodus 12 on, when you see something about month number 7, it's now the month Tishri, where Tishri was before Exodus 12. The month of Tishri was month number 1. All right, let me see if I can show you some things here and help you with this. There are two calendars. Jewish calendar is 354 days. Our calendar is 365. They're missing a month about every 3 years. That's why the barley is the determining factor every year for Passover month. The month of Bib is determined by the barley being within 1 week to 11 days of ready to harvest. They announce it's a Bib. That becomes Passover month. Resets the calendar every few years, adds another month in there. The Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar, basically by the moon. The full moon is always the 14th of their month. Our calendar is a solar calendar, and here's some Jewish and Gregorian calendars together for you there. Here's the month of Abib there, but we're going to skip over these. Here's a leap year where they added Adar 2 because in Bible days, if the barley is not ripe, they add a 13th month. Now they do it mathematically, which is not proper. That's why you'll never figure out the calendar. We don't know where we are in the Jewish calendar. We don't know where we are in God's calendar because they're not doing it right and haven't been doing it right for 2,000 years. All right, and let me go here and find, here we go. Here's the calendars, if you can see that. On the left is what's called the sacred or the religious calendar. You could also call it the agricultural calendar. This is the feast calendar. And this is how it changed. Now over on the right is the civil calendar. They still use this calendar in Israel. Tishri is month number 1 on their calendar. Now on the secular calendar or the civil calendar, the secular calendar, right? But see that? Tishri is the month September or October on our calendar. It is their New Year's. Day number 1 in Tishri is like our January 1st. It's their New Year's. Now this goes all the way back to the book of Genesis. This goes way back. Everybody understood that Tishri was month number 1. By the way, in Exodus chapter 12, God changed it. He said, this month shall be the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. What does that tell you? That tells you that before Exodus 12, if God changed it in Exodus 12, it had to have been something else before Exodus 12. You see what I'm saying? All right, so what was it? It was Tishri. Tishri was month number 1. It was New Year's, which means that most likely is the month and the day at 6 p.m., Tishri 1, when creation started in the Garden of Eden. The Jews believe this, and I think they're right about this. All right, we know the month of Nisan wasn't month number 1 before Exodus. Now, some of these folks who are promoting this Jubilee thing in the month of Nisan are also promoting that they believe creation may have happened in Nisan. That's not possible. Look, we just read in Exodus 12, a couple thousand years later after creation, God says from now on, this is month number 1. What does that mean? That means that for 2,000 years, this was not month number 1. What was month number 1? Right there, Tishri. The same as it is on the secular calendar in Israel today. All right? Elul is month number 12. For the feast calendar, the agricultural calendar, the religious calendar, Adar is the 12th month. But on the secular calendar, it's Elul. All right? Nisan, Tishri. Adar, Elul. The 7th month is Tishri. 7th month on the civil calendar is Nisan. All right? So after Exodus 12, you got to pay attention. The seventh month after Exodus 12 is Tishri, that God is talking about the religious calendar. In Israel, it's Nisan, okay? All right, a couple other things here. So if God changed the first month in Exodus 12, changed it, then it must have been something else before Exodus 12, which means Nisan was not month number 1 in Genesis 1. All right, are you with me there? All right, he telleth the end from the beginning. All right, and Jubilee follows or must follow the same pattern as the sabbatical cycles. Let me ask you a question. When does the 7-day Sabbath end? It ends on the Sabbath, right? On Saturday. What time on Saturday? This is important. Don't miss this. The Sabbath. When does it end? It doesn't end at the beginning of the Sabbath. So in Israel, 6 p.m. is the beginning of Sabbath. Friday night at 6 p.m. is the Sabbath in Israel. That's the beginning of it. When does the Sabbath end? Does it end at 6 p.m. On Friday? Of course not. It just started. Does it end 6 in the morning? Does it end at 9 in the morning? No, you know the answer. It ends at 5:59 that night, the next day. And at 6 p.m. it is now Sunday, the first day of the week. So Sabbath goes from 6 p.m. to 6 p.m. That's not hard, right? You understand that. That's true today. Today happens to be a Sunday. But Sunday doesn't end until 11:59 tonight. At midnight tonight, it will be Monday. So the Sunday, the first day of the week, the Lord's Day, began at midnight while most of us were sleeping and ends at midnight. Same way with the Sabbath in Bible days. All right, let's go a little further. What about the 7-year sabbatical? The 7-year sabbatical. The 6 years they till the ground. The 7th year they let it rest. When does the 7-year cycle end? Does it end at the beginning of the 7th year? Of course not. You know the answer to that already. The Sabbath begins, but it doesn't end when it begins. It ends 24 hours later. When does a sabbatical year end? Does it end 6 months later? As some of them proponents of the Jubilee and Nisan are saying, they're saying that there's a 6-month thing there, a delay, and then the trumpet is sounded. That makes absolutely no sense at all. That does not fit the Bible at all. No, the sabbatical year begins on Tishri 1 and ends, or I should say it begins and then it ends on Tishri 1. All right? So the sabbatical year ends at the harvest, Tishri 1. In the month Tishri, the sabbatical year ends or begins because they harvest their field for the 6th year. They harvest it in the September, in the fall, on Tishri. They harvest their field. That's the end. Now, the sabbatical year begins. Year number 7 begins because New Year is when? Tishri. New Year is not Nisan. Now, Exodus 12, what does that mean? You say, Brother Goodwin, you just read that God changed year number 1. He changed year number 1 on the agricultural religious calendar. He did not change New Year. Because New Year was Genesis 1. The evening and the morning were the first day. That happened on Tishri 1. How do we know that? Because God in Exodus 12, 2,000 years after Genesis 1, God changed the calendar for the Jews, for the agricultural religious system. And God said from now on, Passover month will be month number 1 for you. And Adar will be month number 12, basically. So God changed that. Are you with me? He changed it 2,000 years later. That means it was something else in Genesis 1. What was it? It was right here, Tishri 1. And it's still there. Just because God changed the agricultural religious calendar does not change the fact that creation happened on Tishri and New Year is the same day as creation. You can't change New Year. Can you imagine changing? You can't change your birthday, can you? Can you change your birthday? You can, but it won't mean nothing. It'd be like changing your gender. You can tell everybody you're no longer a boy, you're a girl. That they may even change it on your birth certificate. They may even let you change your name, and they might let you use a different restroom. But you know what? You're still a boy. Doesn't change anything. Creation happened here. Just because God changed the agricultural calendar, that doesn't change New Year. Everybody, are you with me on this? I'm going to show you some scriptures in a minute here. All right, so 7-day Sabbath. When it begins and ends. Begins at 6 p.m., ends at 6 p.m. the next day. All right, in Israel, the Sabbath. Friday night at 6 p.m. to Saturday night at 6 p.m. is the Sabbath. The beginning and end. You see the beginning and end? The sabbatical cycle. The sabbatical cycle goes for 6 years, starting in Tishri. Why Tishri? Because Tishri's New Year. That's where it all begins. Tishri 1 is the harvest of your crop. Every 6 years, you harvest your crop on that same month, Tishri. On that 6th year, that's it. It now becomes the sabbatical year, year number 7. So you've brought in your crop for year number 6, and so it begins on Tishri 1. When it comes to the month Nisan, or the month Nisan here, and you're supposed to plant the barley, or you're supposed to plant your wheat, or you're supposed to plant the fruit and all that later on, you don't plant that 7th year. You let the land lay without planting it. You do not sow your garden. And so harvest comes. Tishri, the month of Tishri, month number 7 on the religious calendar. Tishri comes. There's no crop to harvest because you didn't plant your garden. So year number 7 ends where it began, in the month Tishri. It started there. A year later, it's Tishri again. There's no crop to harvest because you let the land lie without planting it. But now the sabbatical cycle is over. And so in the spring, you will plant your garden again. All right. Now God gives an extra bounty on that 6th year to make up for that. God gives you a double harvest on the 6th year. And we'll look at that in a minute here. All right, so that's 2 of them I showed you. I said I got 3 here. When does the 7-day Sabbath begin and end? We explained that. When does the 7-year sabbatical cycle of the years begin and end? Tishri to Tishri. All right. 7th, when does the Jubilee begin and end? All right, well, let's look. Let's go to Leviticus chapter 25. And looks like I'm going to go over here, and I didn't want to. But Leviticus chapter 25 gives us the story of the Jubilee. And let me see what I want to give you here real quick. All right. Let's see. Here we go. All right, the Jubilee, verses 1 through 7. The Lord spake unto Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When ye come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. 6 years thou shalt sow thy field, 6 years thou shalt prune thy vineyard, and gather in the fruit thereof. Okay, so you sow. When do you sow? In the spring. When do you bring in the harvest? In the fall. Did you catch that? Did you catch that? So the sabbatical cycle, it's just like I said, it begins and ends in the fall, because the whole year is a sowing and a reaping. The whole year, sowing and reaping. Sowing in the spring, reaping in the fall. So the year ends in the fall, starts in the fall and ends in the fall. All right, that's verse 2. Verse 3, 6 years shalt thou sow thy field, and 6 years shalt thou prune thy vineyard, and gather in the fruit thereof. When is that done? In the fall, in Tishri. That fruit is brought in, the fruit harvest is in Tishri. So when does it end? Tishri, all right, 7th month. But in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. Thou shalt neither sow thy field, nor prune thy vineyard. That which groweth of its own accord of thy harvest, thou shalt not reap, neither gather the grapes of thy vine undressed, for it is a year. Again, when do you not harvest? In the spring you don't harvest. When is the reaping done? In the fall. So the entire year goes from the beginning. It goes from fall to fall. But you plant your garden in the spring, you harvest it in the fall. It doesn't end in the spring. That's when you harvest. That's when you plant it. It ends in the fall. So the 7-year sabbatical cycle begins and ends in the fall. All right, now let's look at the Jubilee. Verse 9, Then shalt thou cause the trumpet of the Jubilee. Well, let me start in verse 8. And thou shalt number 7 Sabbaths of years unto thee, 7 times 7. Basically, 7 cycles of those 7 years is 49 years. That's what he just said. So after 49 years, or 7 of these sabbatical cycles, then shalt thou cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. What month is that? That's this month right here. God is talking about the religious agricultural calendar. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of that 7th month, which happens to be what? Happens to be Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. Every 49 years in this month, he didn't say this month, he said this month. On that day, look what it says. In the Day of Atonement shall ye make the trumpet sound throughout all your land. So a trumpet is blown on the 7th month, Tishri, on the 10th day of that month, every 49 years on the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement is on the 10th day of Tishri every year. But every 49 years on that day, on that Yom Kippur, the 6th feast, the Day of Atonement, on that 49th year when they celebrate that, something else happens. A trumpet is blown. Now, that didn't happen the year before or the year before. It happens on a Jubilee year. The trumpet is sounded, and ye shall hallow the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout all the land. Now let me ask you a question. The month of Tishri, if it's New Year's, and it is, it's the new year from Genesis 1. It is the end of the sabbatical cycle. It is the end of each year of Israel. It's the last month. It's the month that they reap the harvest. So it's the end of each year. It's the end of the sabbatical cycle years. All 7 of them end on that month right there. They begin and end there. Tishri 1. It begins and ends. All right. In other words, the final day of Elul would be the ending of the year. Tishri 1 is New Year's. So at the end of Elul is the end of year 5, year 6, and then begins, Tishri 1 begins the sabbatical cycle, the 7th year. And then all the way back to the end of Elul would end that 7th year. Well, on the 49th year, it's the same thing. The whole 7th year begins and ends, and they have no crop. They don't plant their garden. There'll be no harvest in Tishri that year. And so on the 7th month of the sacred calendar, the religious calendar, is the same as the first month on the New Year's calendar. So on New Year's is the new year. So what year is Tishri 1 after that 49th year? Tishri 1 is the beginning of what? The 50th year. Isn't that what it said here? On the 10th day of Tishri, the trumpet is blown, and for the 50th year, guess what? They've been in the 50th year for 10 days now. For 10 days, it's been year number 50. The sabbatical year is over. The 49th year is the 7th year of the 7th cycle. So the 49th year is a sabbatical year. It ends on Tishri 1 with the new year. What year is it now? This is year 50. On a Jubilee year. So the trumpet is sounded actually on the 10th day. It's on the 49th year, but it's now day 10 of the 50th year. And that's where the Bible says here, the 7th month, the Day of Atonement, ye shall make the trumpet sound throughout all your land, and ye shall hallow the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout all the land, all the inhabitants thereof. It shall be a Jubilee. It shall be a Jubilee unto you, and ye shall return every man unto his possession. The entire 50th year. The whole passage here you can read. So the Jubilee begins when? On that 10th day of that 50th year. The 10 days into that 50th year, right after the 49th year, which was a sabbatical year, you go into the 50th year, and guess what? It's another sabbatical year. So there's 2 sabbatical years in a row on the Jubilee. There's the 49th, which is the 7th year of the 7th cycle. The 49th year is a sabbatical year. They didn't plant their garden, and there'd be no harvest that fall. Then on that 10th day is the sounding of the trumpet for the Jubilee, and that entire 50th year is another sabbatical year, 2 in a row. How does God deal with that? And by the way, if it begins there, where does it end? It ends all the way back a year later on Tishri 1, ends that Jubilee cycle. The Jubilee begins in Tishri and it ends in Tishri. It begins on Day of Atonement and it ends on Feast of Trumpets a year later, at the end of the year. That's what the Bible says. Listen, 6 months is not God says that the 50th year should be a Jubilee unto you. Listen, 6 months isn't a Jubilee year. Some are saying that the Nisan is the beginning of the Jubilee, and the sounding of the trumpet here is the end of it. Not so, my friend. That doesn't pass the test. You better rethink that. If Nisan 1 is the beginning of Jubilee, because they think that's the first month, it's the first month on the agricultural religious calendar. It is not the first month on the New Year calendar, the Genesis calendar, and that's what the sabbatical cycles and the Jubilee cycles are going on. Is this right here? Because for 2,000 years there was no Nisan New Year. There was no God hadn't changed the calendar until Exodus chapter 12, a couple thousand years after Adam, or after Genesis, I should say. So, Day of Atonement begins the Jubilee on the 49th year, which is actually the 10th day into Tishri, begins the Jubilee. And it lasts, it's the 50th year. That's the beginning of the 50th year. So when's the Jubilee end? All the way back to Elul 29, actually. 1 minute before Tishri 1, Elul 29 would be the end of the Jubilee. Did you get that? There's more that I want to show you here, but I'm out of time here. Let me do this, though. I want to show you a verse that I saw at 1 o'clock this morning. Look at Exodus chapter 23, way back at the beginning, right? Where all this happened, Exodus chapter 23, where Exodus 12, God changed the calendar, but look at Exodus chapter 23 in verse 10 and 11. This hit me this morning at 1 o'clock. Verse 10 and 11, look what it says. And I wrote in the margin of my Bible, definitely ends in the fall. Look what it says in verse 10 and 11. Verse 9. Exodus 23, beginning in verse 9, and thou shalt not oppress a stranger, for ye know the heart of a stranger, seeing ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. And 6 years thou shalt sow thy land. Now you know what he's talking about there, right? He's talking about the sabbatical cycle, the sabbatical years. 6 years you sow your garden and you reap in the fall. On that 7th year, you don't sow your garden in the spring, and you don't reap in the fall, and it ends in the fall, and then year 8 begins, or it cycles over to the next sabbatical cycle. Or if it happens to be a Jubilee year, year 8 is actually year 50, and that begins the next cycle. That begins the Jubilee, and then the next year 1 will be the year after the Jubilee, will be year 1 of the next 49-year sabbatical cycle. That keeps a perfect 50-year cycle going all the way through history, from Genesis 1 all the way to Revelation 22. But look what it says, 6 years shalt thou sow thy land, and shalt gather in the fruits thereof. Sow thy land, when's that done? In the spring. And gather in the fruits, when is that done? In the fall. Listen, Nisan, some are saying that Nisan is month 1, and that's the beginning. That's when the Lord's coming back for us. No, the Lord's coming back for a harvest. Spring is sowing time. We're in the church age. We're in the springtime. We're sowing. We're getting people into the bride of Christ. We're getting people into the kingdom. And when does the groom come? He comes in the fall. He's coming for a harvest. See, the rapture is a harvest. So 6 years thou shalt sow thy land. That's done in the spring. And shalt gather in the fruits thereof. When's that done? In the fall. Tishri. Month Tishri. Tishri. Okay? So when's the rapture? Probably Tishri. All right? It's certainly what it typifies. Then verse 10, 6 years shalt thou sow thy land. Or verse 11, but in the 7th year, this is verse 11, thou shalt let it rest and lie still, that the poor and thy people may eat, and what they have in the beasts of the field shall eat. So what is he saying here? He said for 6 years you plant, you sow, that's in the spring, and you harvest, that's in the fall. Each year is a spring and a harvest. Are you catching this? What are these biblical sabbatical years God is talking about? He's talking about harvesting in the spring, sowing, planting in the spring, and then that year ends with the harvest in the fall. 6 of those years, spring, sow, in the fall, harvest. That's a year. Okay? Then in the 7th year, it's a sabbatical year, you let the land rest. So what does that mean? That means when spring comes here, you don't go out and till your ground. You don't plant any seeds. You don't do any weeding. You let the land lie rest. All the animals rest. Your servants rest. Then fall comes, which is the reaping time, harvest time. It's the end of that 7th year. There's nothing to harvest because you didn't put anything in the ground. So when does the year begin and end? Tishri to Tishri, fall to fall. There's the spring. Do you see that in verse 10? 6 years shalt thou sow thy land, that's part 1, and gather in the fruits. So those 6 years are spring to fall. All right, so it's fall to fall. I understand that, but it's sowing and reaping. A year is a series of sowing and reaping. Sowing spring, Nisan time, Nisan. Sowing is there, and then harvest is Tishri. All right, you got that? So therefore, it's the same thing with the Jubilee. The Jubilee takes off is in perfect parallel with the 7 sabbatical year, or the 7 cycles of sabbatical years. The sabbatical cycle, the Jubilee fits right in there and takes off on the 10th of Tishri at the end of a sabbatical cycle. On that 49th year, day number 10, 10 days later, is Jubilee. And the entire 50th year goes from what? Tishri to Tishri. All right. All right, I hope that's been a help to you. And I've got more here. Whole bunch. I didn't get to any of this. And I got a whole bunch of other verses that I wanted to show you in Leviticus 25. You can look it up maybe for yourself in verse 20 and 22. It talks about 3 years of extra harvest. Now that means you didn't plant your garden on year 7, so you didn't have a crop to bring in at the end of year 7. So you had no food for year 8. Or year 1 of the next cycle, or if it's a Jubilee year, you had no food for the Jubilee year because you didn't plant your garden. And so there's 3 years there. God gives them a 3-year, on the Jubilee cycle, God gives them 3 years worth of crop on year 48. Or the 48th year, God gives them enough food to last 3 years because they need food for the 49th year, the 50th year, which is the Jubilee, and then because they didn't plant anything on the 50th year, guess what? The next year, year 1 of the sabbatical cycle, there's no food to bring in that year either. So God takes care of that. And you can read that for yourself, Leviticus 25, 20 through 22. God would give them 3 years worth of harvest on that year to store, to take care of them for those 3 years. All right, I hope that's been a help. You're welcome to send me questions or ask me anything you'd like. I'll be glad to talk to you. So this is the God's Final Jubilee program. And I hope it's been a blessing to you here this evening. I hope I've helped you with this thing. And you can find us at godsfinaljubilee.com. And you can email me, daniel@godsfinaljubilee.com. You can go to the website. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel, the Facebook page. And we shall see you next time.